production, actually I've been a member for about a year and a half because I should have been a member like 25 years ago, and I kind of knew you guys existed, but I just didn't do anything. And then finally I met Dave at a neighborhood party and realized, oh, and quite literally I handed him 20 bucks right there at the party, so.
You never got it.
Yeah.
Fred never got it.
And actually I've been an EA member for 36 years, I think it is, so it's kind of overdue. So it's a little background on myself. I'm from Michigan originally, a long time ago. Strangely enough, Kalamazoo, where there's now an excellent aviation museum, but it didn't exist when I was there as a kid. Though we used to see the parachutes fly over all the time in their P-40, and oh, they had a Wildcat, and they had just bought the Bearcat at that point. I used to sneak out of the airport and get kicked out of the hangar all the time. So then I went to school and I worked at Sikorsky, gosh, almost 6 years. Then I moved to the Midwest and worked for Rattan, long distance. And then finally I moved out here and joined a consulting firm in Redmond. I was there about 20 odd years. And then finally, I think they had enough of me, so I was out the door. And so I worked for Raisbeck for a year and finally realized why I should have never worked there. And then one day all my clients, they finally ganged up on me and kept calling me and saying, go out on your own, go out on your own. So that was 4 years ago. And I went out on my own, and boy, I tell you, I should have done it a long time ago. It's worked out extremely well. So my work is kind of 50-50. If you look at most airliners you see today, or if you've ridden them, you know they have internet. Well, the way they have internet is one of two ways. Either it's air to ground, which is what Alaska has. Otherwise, it's all satellite. And it was KU, and everybody's switching over to KA band. And that means there's now 2 or 3 generations of domes out there or systems, and it just keeps coming to my door. I don't know how it happens, but so I got GoGo, Panasonic, Live TV, Row 44, Honeywell, Aerosat. You know, I don't know how I did it, but there. And then the other 50% of my work is special mission aircraft, and it's not all the ones in the United States, but a majority of them. Boeing's got the Challenger down here, the MSA demonstrator. I worked on that. There's a lot of them. Ones you'll never see, ones you probably see all the time, etc. So anyways, that's the professional side. And then on the fun side, I got my pilot's license when I was in college. I got right to the dangerous spot and stopped flying. So I'm 200 hours, and I haven't flown in 32 years, I think. Yeah, so, but I go down to Mojave, for instance, to Hashkey and fly my friends down there, and I let them handle everything. And they hand me the controls, and I forget how to coordinate. Yeah, and then I'm really interested in aviation history, but from kind of a different bent. Because I work on hardware a lot, I'm more interested in the hardware side of things. A lot of people are like operational or personalities or things like that. But I've always been really interested in how the hell they designed the aircraft, what went into it, what decisions did they make, and what was the end result. And to tell you the truth, it ain't documented anywhere. I mean, I did some work on the Mustang about 20 years ago, and the only way I was finally able to get things was go to the National Air and Space Museum and get drawings, go to Ed Horkey, who was still alive down in Arizona, and talk to him about some of the aero. I met Lee Atwood, you know, all those guys, and that's how you find out this stuff, because it ain't anywhere. So anyways, this talk is kind of along that vein. This is one I originally gave up to Historic Flight Foundation. Oh yeah, right here, as it says, back in April. And Mike Lavelle asked me to talk about the technical aspects of the aircraft. So as they said, the real story. And just as a general outline, these are the aircraft. I'm not going to get into some of the other aircraft, like the Italians actually flew CR-42s a little bit, things like that. It's going to be Hurricane, Spitfire, Volt Paul Defiant, and the Messerschmitt 109 and 110C. And the really cool part is, of these pictures, I shot that at Oshkosh. That's a historic flight, or Flying Heritage, I'm sorry. This is actually Flying Heritage also. I didn't shoot this one, but I've been there. That's the museum in Hendon, the Battle of Britain Museum in Hendon, which is where the only Volt and Paul is left. And then, of course, that's just an internet picture because there's no Messerschmitt 110s left anywhere in the world that I know of. There might be one in the museum. Oh, I'm sorry, there's one in the museum in Hendon, come to think of it. So first, these are the guys behind it all. Because you might hear about, Reginald Mitchell. You know, you hear, oh, sorry, right here. No, that's Smith. Yeah, right here. That's R.J. Mitchell. You hear about him sometimes because he was the brains behind the Spitfire. But a lot of these other guys you never hear about. And I find them to be very interesting because a lot of them had legacies that continued on after the war, and things that actually I get involved with at some points even. Sidney Camp, for instance, was a Hawker, and he was the brains behind the Hurricane, actually a lot of the biplanes before that, and he was a Hawker all the way through the Harrier. And the Harrier, of course, is still in service, so his legacy continues. Roy Chaplin was his aero guy. Then a Supermarine, which actually was owned by Vickers, though people tend to forget that. Mitchell died of cancer in 1937, so Joe Smith ended up taking over from. And Joe Smith was there through a lot of the stuff into the 50s when they finally kind of dropped out of it all. And interestingly enough, Beverly Shenstone here was the aerodynamics guy behind the Spitfire and a lot of the related aircraft. And he was a Canadian fellow that had come over before the war to the UK. And after the war, strangely enough, he got completely out of aircraft design, and he was actually an engineer for British European Airways. And if you look him up on the internet, that's actually most of the legacy you'll find on him. And then there was Bolton Paul, John Dudley North, and then of course Messerschmitt. You had Willie Messerschmitt. He was involved in design work, but he was really more of a managing kind of guy. And he joined on the Bavarian Flight Works, what it is, and it got renamed when he took control of it in 1938. And the aero guy was actually Robert Lednecir, who was behind a lot of that. Messerschmitt 109, 110. I think he was a little involved in 262, the jet. Strangely enough, you see helicopters out here quite often. You see BO 105 helicopters. Well, the BO stands for Bolkow, and that was Ludwig Bolkow. Ludwig Bolkow joined Messerschmitt during the war, and he was actually the aero guy in the Messerschmitt 262. And he died 5 or 6 years ago, and I was in contact with him before he died. Got some info off of him. So anyways, got to contrast the design of the aircraft a little bit, kind of give you some background. The Hurricane was actually an older design, and as you can see here, it's got a kind of a Warren truss wing instead of the more conventional ribs and spars you're used to seeing. And originally it was even fabric covered, as I note here. The fuselage was fabric covered through its entire life, but they later came up with a metal covered wing, which was on most of the ones that you're familiar with. As I note here, it was pretty unsophisticated in terms of aerodynamics, and it had a real fatal flaw in that the fuel tank was right here in front of the cockpit. And they had an additional tank here on the wing roof, but the one in front of the cockpit wasn't very well protected from the pilot. Trying to remember, it's either this or the Spitfire. One of the two didn't have a bulkhead even between the fuel tank and the cockpit. And as I'll show you in a little bit, that ended up with some pretty horrific injuries for pilots. Spitfire was actually a later design, designed to a different specification. So note here, all the fuel was in the fuselage right in front of the pilot, but it was fully stressed skin metal fuselage and wing, and you can see the framing and the stringers and everything here. And it was actually a pretty sophisticated airplane for its time aerodynamically. I mean, the thing I always focus on is the fuel tank design. It's like, what were they thinking? The Bolton Paul Defiant was actually, it's one of these cases where there's a specification written, and they designed to the specification, and the specification wasn't such a great idea in the first place. The idea was to have a bomber killer. We had a turret with 4 guns, but no forward-facing armament at all. And so the idea was they're supposed to pull up alongside bombers and shoot them down. Well, the Germans quickly discovered that this airplane had no way to protect itself from the front. And if you attacked it from the front, you were just dead meat. And even worse, the gunner in the turret didn't have a hell of a lot of room, so he had to wear like this diaper-style parachute, and it was very difficult to get out when the aircraft was shot down. You can see he's getting out by turning the turret here, but otherwise, I think, if I remember right, there was a hatch down here, but otherwise he was kind of trapped. So it wasn't that popular in aircraft. The flip side, though, is actually it's a pretty decent design. Sophisticated aerodynamics, as I say, and stressed skin, and fuel tanks were out in the wings where they should be for a combat aircraft. So it was good in some ways and not so great in others. Like the other 3, it had a Merlin at that point, which was a single-stage, single-speed supercharger. Only later did they go to the 2-stage, 2-speed, which was on the Mustang and later aircraft for altitude performance. And then the Messerschmitt 109, which everyone seems to know about. It's actually, some of you might know the name Martin Holman. He was an aircraft designer down in California, died of cancer about 5 years ago. Martin was convinced this is the world's greatest airplane. I used to have endless arguments with him about it. once again, it was designed to a specification for a short-range interceptor, which was the Achilles heel all along. Didn't have much range, but it was a pretty advanced design for its time. And then, of course, they kept increasing the power on it, which really helped. And they had a fuel-injected engine. All the others are carbureted, and I'll point out where that came into play later on. It was a design that kept morphing. In fact, actually, interestingly enough, when the very first one flew, the British had supplied some Rolls-Royce Goshawk engines to the Germans for use in a Heinkel 70 research aircraft. Well, one kind of got stolen out of the shipment, and that was actually used for the first flight of the Messerschmitt 109. So it first flew with a Rolls-Royce engine. And of course, at the end of its life, when they were being used in Spain, they actually took 109 airframes and put Merlins in them, and that's actually a lot of what you see today. The one downstairs here in the museum is actually a Spanish airframe that's been modified backwards to look like a 109E, but it really isn't. I know it's all stress skin, relatively sophisticated aerodynamics. But Achilles heel was the fuel tank was actually kind of underneath the pilot's seat and behind him. Though I've never really found much evidence that that caused much in the way of burns or fire damage with pilots. And then lastly, the 110, long-range, two-engine bomber escort of sorts with a rear gunner. Fuel in the wings, pretty good, stress skin, sophisticated, but a dog. So it was a neat idea, but it didn't work. And the way it really found its ultimate use was when the bomber streams were going into Germany at the end of the war, and they set them up as night fighters with radar and things like that. But during the Battle of Britain, they didn't do too well. So the fire danger, and this was a really big issue. Yeah, it was a hurricane that the header tanks weren't isolated. So quite literally, you were looking at the backside of the fuel tank if you look under the instrument panel. And self-sealing was added, but it wasn't there in the beginning. And this is actually kind of a famous incident. This is James Nicholson, who won the Victoria Cross during the Battle of Britain. And what happened was, his hurricane, as shown in this painting, was shot up, and the fuel tank caught on fire, and he had flames coming at him. He went to bail out, and he realized he had a German fighter in his sights. So he actually climbed back in the cockpit, shot down the German fighter, and then bailed out. Yeah, he won the Victoria Cross for it. This is a picture before. I've seen pictures of him afterwards, and the things they do at Harborview, for instance, for burn victims, so a lot of that grows out of the damage, the physical damage the pilot suffered in the Battle of Britain. And they were coming up way doing skin grafts and things like that. Though it was pretty horrific to see the photos. And he survived all that. Then as a note, as far as flying here, they're breathing pure oxygen above 15,000 feet. They weren't in a pressurized cockpit, which can get very uncomfortable up at high altitudes. I've had friends that have been in unpressurized cockpits at like 28 to 30,000 feet, and they say, yeah, you're on oxygen, even pressure, but it's just plain not comfortable, and they have to deal with that. The cockpits were supposed to have been well heated, though I kind of wonder about that. They didn't have G suits, so when you're pulling G, your blood's going to your legs, and you're graying out or even blacking out. They didn't have fire-resistant flight suits because Nomex hadn't been invented yet, which is something we all take for granted nowadays. If you went out, had to bail out over water, you didn't have poopy suits or anything like that to help you survive in the water, so you had to be picked up soon, or you're dying of hypothermia. There weren't crash helmets yet. I mean, that's it, the leather. I mean, when you see John Sessions fly a Spitfire, it looks like that's what he's wearing, but it's really a crash helmet. So yeah, you're a risk from that. And then the whole idea of, as a military pilot, if you bail out these days, you've got beacons, rescue radios, everything. They date back to the 50s. In Vietnam, they were heavily used. Didn't exist then. So if you bailed out, someone had to see you bail out. Otherwise, that was it. They had no idea what happened to you. So it wasn't, I mean, even now it isn't pleasant, but even then it was a lot more of kind of you're really going out on a limb. So one of the things I've done a lot of is getting a hold of the original drawings of the aircraft and building up computer models and then doing computational fluid dynamics simulations. And these were some I did about 10, 15 years ago. This is, of course, the Spitfire. That's a Mark 9, actually, which is after the Battle of Britain. And then this is a 109F, which actually was at the very end of the Battle of Britain. The note I have here about the NACA airfoils, the wing design of these aircraft were from stuff that the predecessor to NASA had developed in the 1930s. And it got both brought to Germany in the form of these airfoils right here that Messerschmitt liked. And then Beverly Shenstone brought this series of airfoils to the UK right after they were developed. From my standpoint, one of the things I see right off the bat is this right here is the hottest suction anywhere on the aircraft, where it's magenta. And you can see how the suction occurs fairly far forward on the wing on both aircraft. And that was kind of a state of the art at the time, though not necessarily something that was purely desirable. The other thing you notice about Spitfire is, if you look up the canopy, you can see all the suction on the canopy. And I've seen artist conceptions of people take Spitfires and dives and the shock waves building up, and they never show it on the canopy, but the truth is that's the first thing to shock up on a Spitfire. So anyways, this is the Mustang and the Hawker Sea Fury. And the Mustang actually benefited from some more NASA research right before the war. And you can see how the suction on the wing of the Mustang goes a lot further back. And this is to support laminar flow. And the reputation has been that's why the Mustang was so fast. That was the Ed Gorky school, which I don't agree with. Lee Atwood and those guys always said it was the cooling system, and that's what I tend to believe about the aircraft. And then this, of course, is the Sea Fury, which is actually post-war and has some British developed airfoils which are aft-loaded. Suction continues a lot further back, too. And, of course, these are two of the major competitors at Reno. So getting the cooling systems, back in those days, a lot of cooling systems were just heat exchangers hung out in the breeze. And they didn't necessarily work that great. And that's why they kept getting bigger or they played games with them. So in Spitfire, they tried burying them in the wing, and that's actually the real honest-to-God geometry, what's inside the wing. They knew it didn't work that great, but they had no idea why at the time. So in my analysis, what I discovered is the flow on the bottom of the wing gets inside that duct and it separates. So the total pressure that's getting to the radiator, which is what you need to cool, was diminished. And they dinked with that thing through the war and never did quite solve the problem. The Hurricane and Defiant just kind of had a heat exchanger stuck in a duct that probably worked good enough. But the Messerschmitt 109 was a little more sophisticated. Once again, it was buried, but they kept dinking with it, trying to get it to work. And later on, they put a boundary layer bleed right here, like it's on the Messerschmitt or on the P-51, and they kept pursuing it. And of course, the engines, the Merlin II. Which you don't see that many of these days. More often than not, like down at Reno, you'll see the later model Merlins, drawing a blank on which model it is, but they have the two-stage supercharger. And then and of course it's carbureted. The carburetor is kind of in back of right here. And there's actually a Merlin down there in the personal courage wing you can take a look at. That's one of the later ones. And then this is the Daimler-Benz engine. It's a bit bigger. They're both V12s. It's got a hydraulically driven supercharger, which is kind of unusual. Kind of canted. It's off on the side. And then it's fuel injected, as I noted. The thing was, the British had access to 100-octane fuel, but the Germans didn't. They were running on 87-octane. And because of the 100-octane, you could pull more power on a Merlin before you got detonation, which was a real advantage the British had. And a lot of that 100-octane fuel came from the United States during the Battle of Britain. So this is the power output you could get from the engines against altitude. And if you were to take like a Cessna or a Piper or something, and as you take off and climb, the power keeps diminishing as you go up with altitude. It lasts roughly like this, but it goes all the way to sea level. So with their supercharging, they could actually hold or actually increase power to a given critical altitude. And then you started lapsing. And you can see also the Merlins, you could run them at two different boost levels. And I give the conversions actually between atmosphere and PSI of boost. But you could get quite a bit more power. And of course with the 100-octane fuel, you could hold it because of the, you wouldn't detonate. So this is part of what really decided the battle. The Germans were operating aircraft with a range of only 410 miles. And these are the airfields they were operating from in northern France. So as you can see, if you were to go out on a mission with a 109, by the time you got to here, you were having to turn back or you're going to run out of fuel. So the obvious question is, why didn't they carry drop tanks? Well, it turned out they did have drop tanks. They were plywood, and the glue wasn't very good on them. And they had them at the airfields, and they couldn't use them. So the 109s never carried external fuel during the Battle of Britain. On the other hand, the British squadrons were based in bases in this area, and they could go out, intercept, and come back without a problem. And they, the range was kind of in the ballpark of the 109. So the Germans were limited about how much escort they could provide to the bombers. The other thing that was going on also is the British fighters had 830-03 machine guns, and the Germans, though, had developed 20mm aircraft cannon at that point. As I note here, cannon shells explode. Bullets don't. They just go through things. So they actually had much heavier firepower than the British, but of course you had to be able to use it. And there's also the visibility aspect. You know, now when you look at an F-16, you have a full 360-degree, actually from below the horizon all the way up. These guys were constrained, especially on the Hurricane. You couldn't really look behind you except using the rearview mirror. You could see on top of the cockpit. And it was pretty heavily framed, so you could lose things in the frames. Of course, the Spitfire with Malcolm Hood was better, and of course you had a rearview mirror. The Germans, strangely enough, didn't really catch on to rearview mirrors. They had a heavily framed canopy. It was kind of tight. It was all with flat glass on the sides. The British put bullet-resistant glass in the front, and the Germans didn't use as much. So in that way, the Messerschmitt 109 kind of, I don't know, had a handicap. The other real thing the British had an advantage with was radar. They had developed a radar system before the war, because radar had been developed almost simultaneously all over the world. But some people knew what to do with it, and some people said, well, what do we use it for? The Germans used it for monitoring shipping. But the British understood they could actually get it, they could get airborne, well, early warning, I shouldn't say airborne because it was ground-based. And then the other thing they had the sense to do was use a centralized command and control system. So all these radar stations answered back to a command and control center which could actually coordinate the fighters, which, if you think about it, it's pretty advanced. It's kind of like what we do with an AWACS aircraft today. And then the Germans actually developed a better combat formation for their flights within the squadrons, called the finger four, after how your fingers would look. So lead man, wingman, and then the wingman to the second leader, member of the flight. The British at first used these. It didn't work that great, and they eventually realized this was the way to go and switched over to it. And then the last thing is sun position. And this, I mean, you've all probably, well, especially commuting in Seattle across the bridge, you know, you look into the sun, you can't see for beans. So the mornings favored the Germans, and the afternoons favored the British. And the British and their command and control centers actually were monitoring where the sun was all through the day, trying to get their fighters up into the sun so when they came down on the German squadrons or the formations, they couldn't be as readily visible. So there was a lot of maneuvering factors in those days. Dogfights, it's not like beyond visual range like we have now. There was level speed, you're trying to pull away from someone. There's rate of climb, trying to outclimb them. Of course, turning radius, roll rate, the ability to dive away from someone, and then finally how high you can get as you come in to intercept. And of course, this is one of the battles over downtown London. So the goal of the British fighters was to get high into the sun, because the German bombers tended to come in about 16 to 20K feet, and then the escort fighters were above them. So the British wanted to jump them. So the trick was getting them airborne and up to altitude before the Germans arrived. And so this then became the rate of climb issue. And as you can see, if you had like a Hurricane or a Spitfire at high boost, you could actually get a pretty good rate of climb and get up above and get position. And the British used that to great advantage. Then of course level speed, and of course the Spitfire with 12 psi boost was quite a fast airplane in comparison to the others. You can see the Hurricane was kind of a dog speed-wise. I mean, as I say, it was less sophisticated aircraft. And then of course turn radius, which is really key. And this is where the Spitfire had it. This is a 14-second turn at max rate of turn. What I've done is these black lines connect at moments in time. And you can see as the turn develops, the Spitfire can turn way inside of any one of the other aircraft. And that was a great advantage they had. If you've been up at Payne Field for the Flying Heritage demonstrations, they've actually taken their Zero and their P-40 out and done max rate of turn, and you can see something very similar. The Spitfire had, or I'm sorry, the Zero had much greater rate of turn than the P-40, for instance. And then roll rate, which is key. So if you want to initiate a turn, of course, rolling into it, how fast can you roll into it? The British had a problem that they started out with fabric-covered ailerons on their aircraft, and the reason being to get balance, because you don't have weight after the hinge line that way. And of course, they suffered roll rate because of that. So they went to metal-covered ailerons, which really improved things. But that was only kind of after the Battle of Britain. That was Spitfire 5 and things like that. And diving. one of the things that someone attacked you, you could push over in a dive and dive away from them. And the one thing, the Messerschmitt 109 had a really high dive speed, but it was pretty hazardous. The controls got very heavy. It was really difficult to recover. And then, of course, the next best one was the Spitfire. So that, in theory, they could use it, but there was a problem. And that was the issue of they were carbureted. So when you pushed over, all the fuel would float at 0 G, the engine would cut out, and then you had to do something to get your engine going again, or you'd have to roll and pull. So this was a gal who worked at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, Beatrice Tilley, and she came up with this. This is a carburetor restrictor that you would put in the float chamber and acted as a baffle to keep the fuel from going out away from the feed. And they quickly fitted them in Merlins. It really helped out. And as I noted here, because the Messerschmitt 109 had a fuel-injected engine, they didn't have this problem. They could push over without a problem. The one advantage the Germans had was Bosch had developed precision machining necessary to build the metering pumps, and the British didn't have that technology. And of course, that's the same Bosch that if you open the hood of Volkswagen or an Audi or something, that's the same company. So altitude performance, you can see, you can get up into the very high altitude bands in most of these aircraft. So a lot of the combat happened fairly high. And kind of in a conclusion, as I note, the Defiant was an ill-conceived concept. They built what they were asked to be built, but it just didn't work. And they withdrew them from combat in August 1940, which actually was kind of the middle of the Battle of Britain. The Messerschmitt 110 had good firepower. They could get the range, but the trouble was they couldn't maneuver. And the Spitfire and the 109E were very closely matched. Of course, as I said, the pushover and the dive and the fuel quantity in the 109 were kind of the yin and yang that could make a difference, and the rest of it was pilots. And then the Hurricane, as I know, it was outclassed, but it was still useful. They used it for going after the bombers. So the Spitfires would pull away the fighters in dogfights, and the Hurricanes would try to go after the bombers. And there were actually a lot more Hurricanes available during the battle than the Spitfires. So the outcome, in the course of the battle, which was roughly July to October 1940, the RAF lost about 1,500 aircraft. Luftwaffe lost 1,800, slightly more. But the thing was, look at the air crew that was lost. The Luftwaffe suffered much higher losses because they were over British territory or the North Sea. So because of that, we don't speak German. Now, so this is a little personal part of it. My father was born in Antwerp, Belgium, right there, in 1929. And the family was a Jewish family, and they lived in Belgium through 1940. And May 10th, my father woke up to a sound we thought was a jackhammer, but it wasn't a jackhammer, it was anti-aircraft fire. And he looked out the window and he saw an aircraft falling in flames. So his father was really wise, and they had passports and visas and everything. So they fled. As I note here, they went to Brussels, they went out to the coast of Dupont. They were hoping to sit it out in Dupont, and they realized they couldn't. So they went to this little coastal town called Dunkirk, and caught a train and ended up, they caught a truck and ended up at Paris. Well, if you look at the dates, they basically made it out of Dunkirk 2 days before the Germans encircled the city. I mean, it was a really close call. And then the Germans, of course, came into France from the north, and they went south, managed to get into Spain and Portugal. And as I noted, they departed Lisbon for Brazil in November 1940. If you think about it, if the Germans had prevailed in the Battle of Britain, the Spanish probably would have had a much different attitude towards refugees fleeing. Because at that point, what's their loss in joining the fascists? So really, because of the way the Battle of Britain came out, really determines the fact that I'm alive. I'm here. So that's kind of my personal interest in all of it. There's a lot more to the story. It's really something. So anyways, the last thing is where to see the aircraft. As I know, Historic Flight Foundation's got a Mark 9. Flying Heritage has got a Mark 5, which is actually closer to the Battle of Britain standard. And this is Flying Heritage. That's Historic Flight with John Sessions flying it. Of course, Flying Heritage has got a later model Sea Hurricane, which outwardly looks a lot like the ones in the Battle of Britain. And there's a Defiant, as I know, in that museum in Hendon. And then, of course, the really treasure we have is the Flying Heritage Collection. It actually has a 109E flying with the original engine. And so you can go up there in summer and actually see it fly. And then as I note, there's several survivors of the 110, but that's about it. Nothing flying. So we're kind of in a really unique position in the Seattle area that you can go and actually see these airplanes fly. So on that note, any questions?
Going back to that, those pictures you had of the areas of low pressure and the high pressure, what aerodynamically is the significance and what is better or what's the result of that? Is the control factor, max speed, or?
Well, there are
what's
several
the
things.
advantage?
Max rate of turn is how much lift you can pull on the wing before the wing starts stalling on you, how many G's you can pull. And usually airfoils that are forward loaded like this, you can usually get a slightly higher maximum lift coefficient unless you play games. So in theory, this is a better way to go for a wing in that regard. On the other hand, if you have a wing design like on the Mustang, for instance, it's in theory much lower drag. But I can show you plots that they never ever got that low drag. In theory also, it was better at high speeds just for handling characteristics. There's a lot of reports of Spitfires being on very high Mach numbers, not supersonic, but high Mach numbers, and supposedly being okay. And I kind of view it with a grain of salt because I'd rather have a Mustang at high speeds. Of course, the opposite with the P-38. If you got out at high Mach numbers on that, your tail got blanked out and you had trouble recovering before you got into the ground. So in theory, this is lower drag and a better way to go. But there's games you can play. I mean, the Mustang designers, if you notice, the wing is not constant chord. They have a cuff, and you could use that to get a little bit more lift. Things, you know, CL Max and things like that. So a lot of it, they were looking at drag and maximum lift capability. Other questions? Dave?
How did the Mustang stack up against the Spitfire?
Well, it kind of depends on which Mustang.
Well,
Yeah. The Allison-powered ones, they didn't have altitude capabilities. They had a single-stage supercharger, so they were just regulated to ground attack. But the Merlin-powered ones were very capable. They had a lot more range, they had more speed, and from what I've read, they're pretty much even keel with the Spitfire, at least the contemporary Spitfires as far as handling qualities. And actually, one thing I don't show here, I've been, you guys go to Reno, and the reason I haven't ever seen any of you at Reno is I always go for Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday to practice and qualifying. Yeah, because I've crewed on quite a few of the airplanes, Nemesis, Rare Bear, Critical Mass, things like that. In fact, I actually got a scar on the top of my head from the landing gear door in Critical Mass. Yeah, it's really cool. I have a hat. What? Yeah, no kidding. I actually have a hat with a black mark. I refused to clean it off because I stood up into the pocket gear door and caught it. And Peggy Dwelly drove me down to the Reno hospital in her Cadillac with white leather seats, and I had blood streaming down my face. And then the craziest thing was they stitched me up, and at 3:30 or 4 in the afternoon, I managed to make the 6:30 flight home to Seattle. And I walked in the house, and my wife looked at me and said, "What happened to you?" Because I just had, my hair was caked with blood. But I've got similar pictures of Rare Bear that we've actually used for doing cleanup work on it. That was when Dave Cornell was crew chief, but there's been a turnover now, and the Zell folks are running it. But, this is very useful, even now, for working on these aircraft. In fact, this model was done for Critical Mass originally, but they had some much more basic problems with their airframe, like huge drain holes in the bottom of the wing that they never capped. So, any other questions?
You know how the later clip wing Spitfires performed in relation to the elliptical wing?
Yeah, they were supposed to be better. If I remember right, they were more tuned to low altitude performance as opposed to the long wing ones being more for high altitude. One semi-myth you'll often hear is that the elliptical wing made it the minimum induced drag. Well, there were 2.5 degrees of twist on that wing, and it wasn't elliptically loaded. So it's a real myth. Yeah, in fact, actually, I've got the drawings on the Spitfire, and yeah, the ellipse was actually mostly there because they wanted to put 4 guns in each wing, and somehow you have to fit in the ammunition trays, and they're pretty tall. So to keep the thickness to chord ratio modest, you want to keep the chord big as far outboard as possible. to cover over, and also the landing gear, of course, came up outboard into the wing. So the ellipse was just a very nice natural shape for that.
How did the Mosquito compare aerodynamically to these other fighters?
It was always supposed to be really fast. I've never really found that much information on a Mosquito, so I've never really investigated it. But that's always the reputation. The one thing that is really, to me, is fascinating is it was all wood construction. And a lot of what you want is good, stable skin surfaces, so you don't get waviness and stuff like that. And of course, these days with composite, we're getting a lot closer to being able to maintain that. Metal, of course, over time, you develop waves and stuff. And of course, wood is about the most, well, it can be the most unstable thing out there with humidity and stuff. So that's a future project, I suppose you might say. It was really, to me, it's one of the most interesting airplanes. I've actually got the Focke-Wulf 190 drawings for A, B, TA-152, I mean the whole line, and I've built models of several of them. And the aerodynamics, interesting enough, the wing was an American airfoil design again that Kurt Tonk evolved into a really great design. The only thing that had really going against it was a really nasty stall. If you look at pilot reports, by and large, once you started pulling G on the airplane, you got to a certain G level, and the airplane just, without any warning, would cut loose on you and flick over if you were in a turn, or if you're straight and level, just really have a nasty stall. And the British discovered, they captured several very early in the going and discovered this, and just took maximum advantage of it. And so it was good, but it had a weak point, yeah. And of course, they evolved it with longer wings, go at altitude, and they had pressurized cockpits even, so they could go after high altitude bombers and stuff. It was really an impressive airplane.
At the little raised birds, how much do you have?
Hey, I'm trying to remember. I think, yeah, I was going to guess somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 to 6. Yeah, I don't remember right off the top of my head. Well, you know, one of the things is pilots will tend to lie about G. Yeah, I've worked on the Red Bull racers, and they told me, oh, design the wing for, I forget what it was, 9 Gs or something. So I finally got a video, cockpit video of a guy flying the Red Bull course, and I just real slowly stepped through it, and that guy was pulling like 12 to 14 Gs. I was like, holy crap, how can you do that? So it seems like the higher they go, the more they downplay it, but the ones that, like me, you're in the low side, well, yeah, you kind of round it up. But yeah, it was probably 5 to 6, yeah. Any other questions?
I think I heard you say that really developing out of the cooling.
Partly cooling, partly the fuel injection versus the carburation. I mean, it was a very even thing. So a lot of
that sustained power for what's the typical length of an actual vehicle?
well, with the 109, I mean, it was quite literally like 5 minutes or so, and they had to be out of there because they're out low on fuel. And a lot of them ended up either ditching. In fact, if you go to the RAF Museum in Hendon, they have, oh wait, no, was it 109? I think it was a Hurricane, I don't remember which. They had one of the two that ditched on the beaches. And yeah, that was a very common thing, which results in those aircrew losses you see.
There was an interesting article in Kipling magazine recently where they tried to rebuild or configure a P-51 style belly coil cooler and then roll back.
Oh, I'll have to look for that. Okay. Yeah, a lot of the Reno guys have dinked around with them, for better or for worse. Kirchenfeld, many years ago, ripped Strega apart, and he took the radiator, which is canted, and put it vertical, and then he decided he was going to redo the inlet. And he came up with this really shallow inlet, and he took all the boundary layer air directly in, which should cause trouble. And I analyzed it and said, yeah, I wouldn't do that. And then they went up fluid, and he said, oh, it's great. So I was down there in the pits, and I said, really? And he goes, yeah. And I said, so what's your cooling flow on the spray bars? He goes, oh, it doubled. And I'm like, yeah, that explains it. So, yeah, they're making up for kludging things by just dumping more water on the radiators there. But yeah, if you do it right, you can really get the drag down.
So, as good as the Merlin was, why did they never do it?
They didn't really have the ability to do the micro machining to make the metering pumps, and the Germans did. And I mean, traditionally, look at the Germans. They're one of their skills has always been high quality machining and production, and the British just weren't there. I mean, the story was when Rolls-Royce had Ford start building Merlins in the UK, Ford looked at the production drawings and said, what are you doing here? Because the tolerances are so loose. And they had to go back and work with Rolls-Royce, to actually adjust things so they could make them right. And I don't know what the story is with Packard made them, but I imagine it's very similar. So, I mean, most cars these days have fuel injection. And what's underneath the hood of your car is really rather remarkable because it did not exist by and large in the 40s. And hell, the first cars I bought when I was a kid, they had carbureted engines. I remember the hell we went through getting them to work right. And now it's all fuel injected, computer controlled, spark advances controlled. I mean, it's amazing. Yeah.
You were mentioning about the nasty stall characteristics of the popular aerodynamically, what causes that? What causes one airplane to have very long stall?
I don't have the plot here with me, but the Focke-Wulf 190 had a NACA 5-digit airfoil at various thicknesses used out along the wing. And two-dimensionally, that airfoil has a nasty stall. It goes up to CL max and goes wham. But that doesn't mean that the airplane will necessarily do that. So if you tailor the wing, you can still get a decent stall out of it. The thing was, Focke-Wulf, they had a really weird twist distribution in their wing. If you look at it, the twist goes, and then it gets to the mid aileron and stops. In fact, you look at the trailing edge of a Focke-Wulf 190 aileron, you can actually see the twist break. So first they had that, and then I found a German paper from during the war where they looked at it, aeroelastically they had a problem also. They had a fairly soft wing. So as they got towards stall, the wing would actually twist up a little bit on them, and they would stall like 3/4 of the wing, all like that, which of course produces a really nasty stall. By and large, I mean, let's see, you have a Navion's a different airfoil. Yeah, well, it's got a really strange one, but there's a lot of general aviation airplanes with the same airfoil on it, but they've done the wing design right, tailored the stall, and they're fine. ATR 42 actually has very similar airfoils on it. And there was a guy who used to write Aviation Week about every 4 years claiming they should all be grounded because of that. Yeah, it was hairy. Yeah. I mean, Harry is good, but I'm glad when he died, I realized I finally couldn't get sued for what I said. So any other questions?
Yeah, one little quick one. The configuration of the Rolls-Royce, they considered it, the cylinders were up. And
Yeah.
a lot of the German engines had the cylinders facing downward.
Right.
What was the benefit of that?
I don't know as far as engine output. There was a lot of arguments that you could make a lower drag airframe because instead of having a lot of frontal area up here, you could kind of move it down to where the wing was going to be and things like that. I don't totally subscribe to that. But it was kind of the mindset they got in at the very beginning. And, you know, the Daimler-Benz engines were very good engines.
Yeah.
And Rolls-Royce had to go through a lot of iterations to really get the Merlin working really good. I mean, they changed the head design. If I remember right, they changed a lot of the sleeve, or the cylinder block design. I mean, so I'd really say it was just different philosophies.
Did they have any, was the fuel injection, did that have anything to do with the configuration of the cylinders?
I don't remember what the head design looks like on a Daimler-Benz. It was direct injection.
Yeah.
I think both of them are pretty similar. Originally, the Rolls-Royce engines had flat heads, but I think they went to a kind of a hemispherical design, if I remember right. And they were all 4-valve, because that's what you need to get the flow swept through in the time you have. Yeah, I don't really know. I wonder where there's a Daimler-Benz engine we could look at. I mean, obviously there's one in the 109 here, but it's hidden up by the ceiling. Yeah, I don't really know, to tell you the truth.
I know their one advantage was they were able to mount cannon
Yeah,
up on top of the engine, so.
yeah, and it always looks like the 109Es had a four shaft cannon, but they didn't. But it was kind of set up in that regard that if they really wanted to go that way, they could have done it.
I think the 190s had cannon,
They,
or did they go?
no, they were up
center?
high on the top of the hull, both in the radial engine version and the inline version, the Jumo.
The 109F had that 30 millimeter,
Which model?
might have been the F model or the.
Yeah, I'm
TA
thinking-
152.
I'm thinking F or G.
The 152 FW 190 had a cannon through the nose,
Okay.
through the spinner.
Yeah, of course, the other one's P-39, your Aerocover. I mean, that was all set up to have a cannon going through the spinner. And a lot of other interesting stuff.
You said it had direct injection. In other words, direct injection to the cylinder?
Yeah, I mean, that's the sophistication
That's,
they have.
that's actually more sophisticated than just having fuel injection.
Right, which is just replacement for carburetor in the
Yeah.
Venturi, yeah. No, they were sophisticated.
That would have been probably a big way that they managed to deal with the lower octane fuel.
Yeah.
Because if you don't inject until the ignition point, you don't get detonation.
Yeah, that's a good point. I hadn't really thought about that aspect of it. Yeah, it probably is the case. Yeah, they managed to make do with 87 octane or worse even all through the war. And it was just the American refineries in Louisiana that produced 100 octane. I think that was catalytic cracking, if I remember right, that enabled it, which the Germans didn't have. And of course, we had good supplies of oil, and they didn't. In fact, that's why they took over Romania to get access to the Polesti field, which I want to visit someday. Go ahead. Yeah.
Did the spring-loaded leading edge slats on the 109 actually improve combat performance? Or is that?
Yeah. Oh, no, that was for maneuvering. They were spring-loaded so that as you, I think it was as the dynamic pressure decreased on it, remember right? They would spring forward and you could actually pull a little more before you stalled on the outboard panels. Yeah, and the A4, right, the A4 Skyhawk had them too. Yeah. Very, very similar.
Have you done any research or any investigation of the Russian aircraft, like the IL-2 or the X?
I haven't done those. Obviously, information's kind of hard to find. Though there's a website, I don't know, some of you might have seen, called Avialogs on the web, and God knows where the hell they get it, but they have Russian documents that blow your mind. I mean, there's a MiG-25 aerodynamics report that's in Russian. And I've done some work for the Indian Navy on an Aleutian 38, and they gave me the flight manual, which was really pathetic. And I went on that website and I found an Aleutian 18 flight manual, and it was actually OCR'd in Russian. I could drop it in Google Translate and read it in English, and I actually used that for a lot of my work. So I'll have to look again, see what's there, yeah. Yeah, and also I've done work on a Sukhoi 30, but we didn't get any information from the Russians on that one. But, and it was for the Indian Air Force and an Israeli company, yeah.
At the start of the battle, didn't the British just have 87 octane also? And then we eventually gave them the 100?
Yeah, the 100 wasn't there for moment one, but it came in very early in the battle, yeah.
But didn't they, British planes also have a problem in the fuel systems? Because they were engineered for 87 and 100 octane caused a problem with the deterioration in the inside of the
I wasn't aware of that, but I have heard of similar things happening. I worked on Pond Racer, and that whole fuel system was designed for methanol, and they gave it to a different crew one year, and the other crew said, we don't want to deal with methanol, so they put avgas in it, and then they discovered the power they could get with methanol, so they went back to methanol and just corroded the hell out of the fuel system. And that's why the second year of the Pond Racer was a Reno, it just sat there on the ramp all weeks because they were rebuilding the whole fuel system. Yeah. Any other questions? Great, thank you.